601 podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Shelby Thompson. I'm a graduate student at CCM, Cincinnati Conservatory College of Music. I'm getting my DMA in viola performance, and our other host, I'll let him introduce himself.
Yep, I'm Lee Burgess. I'm a master's student, also at CCM, part of the University of Cincinnati, and I am getting a graduate degree in music education. And I've been a band director for a really long time, and yeah.
So we both met totally virtually, actually, which is fun. Very,
in the middle
very
of this
sign of
pandemic.
the times. Yeah.
Very 2020.
Very 2020. In our graduate history course called Cincinnati Sounds, taught by Dr. Meyer. We fatefully got brought together on the basis of having to do a project, met in the good old Zoom chat.
As one meets people now these days.
Yeah. Hey, so now we kind of had two separate people that we wanted to research as a part of exploring musicians and what history Cincinnati has. And we kind of found two people that we think are going to be providing with an interesting conversation.
Yeah, and just because we're starting with these two, we're going to expand a lot of these conversations too, hopefully out to other types of characters that we find in history that deal with music. So the first two that we're dealing with this episode are Henry Fillmore and Artie Matthews. So both are Cincinnatians, both are musicians who really influenced two very different realms of music. And we're going to kind of explore what all that's about, why they were able to proliferate the way they were able to, and what does that mean for us now, and what does it mean, and how do we answer how we're going to move forward.
100%. So for me, when we got assigned this project, it was very much on the basis of trying to do something different in music, and I think we both can agree that, and I'm sure even if you're not a musician, you historically have learned, it's a lot of the same stuff. If you've taken a U.S. history course over your life, it's just
it's the same story.
Yeah, same story. Yeah, same stuff. So I think I was inspired by and sort of challenged, especially in the times that we're living in, to go outside of the normal realm and let's explore someone that we haven't heard a lot about. And also, if we can just dive right in here, folks, just dive in, being a little white lady existing in the US, I was what is something that I can educate myself on that moves away from just this norm and explore someone that I think kind of doesn't have a voice because of their race. So I guess that's my contribution. I don't know. So yeah, that's kind of my inspiration going down.
See, but that's the crazy thing though, Shelby, is we talk about it feels really small on our end because right. I guess we're kind of youngins in this whole academic world. And for our entire lives, academic has been used as a noun or an adverb, yes, or an adjective to just say to describe someone I am an academic. But I think something about our generation and the just younger folks who are in academics, they want to embody academics. They want to turn academics into a verb. So I think doing by trying to synthesize what this high-minded learning that we're getting, and to be honest, an ivory tower, because CCM is known for being very top notch, and it is internationally renowned as well. It has international renown as well. So we have something. So we have access to a lot of this knowledge, and I know that for me, I'm a black guy from South Carolina, right? So I am very used to power being wielded at me, and I'm not used to power being wielded by me or even just for me. It's just I'm not used to that. And so I guess that's what brought me Fillmore, because I'm always just interested in how we've come to acknowledge so and so as a giant in our field, right? What constitutes being part of the canon? What constitutes being viewed as a grandfather or a father of and most of the time that's who it is a grandfather or father of music and how we understand band and how we understand American music and culture as in general.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about it, and also very interesting that we've chosen two different people because of our own experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Like for me,
almost opposing, really, like because Artie Matthews, a black man, and like Henry Fillmore, a white man, and like I, a black guy, wanted to study the white guy, and you, a white woman, wanted to study the black guy. It's just like, well, I think that's very 2020 as well. It's just like 100%. There's finally like this like moment of like wanting to understand the other side.
Yes.
And I think it gets lost as tension, but I think that is growth, right? Like growth exists in tension.
100%. And I think for me, like, so when I started this project, really the moment that really hit me was when we went over Stephen Foster, minstrelsy, music. I never learned about that, and I was just like, that's crazy.
Which is crazy too, because like I'm a black guy, and like I didn't really learn about that either, because like we all go through the same public American education.
100%. But like, do I know "Oh Susanna" by heart?
Yes, I do.
Sure do, Mama. Sang that in my elementary school, and that's like, I think the biggest thing for me is like, you know, we need to go back and we need to see these mistakes that we've made and these people that we kind of idolize and overlook things that they've done in their life versus people we've silenced because we're like, we just pass over them because that doesn't fit in with what our society deems is going to be the best or appropriate or like whatever, so on and so forth.
Like even to that point, like I was looking at like just going through Henry Fillmore's like people who have written biographies about him or like people who have gone through and written blurbs around him, because like at this point he is a lightning rod for band, honestly, like American
I've heard
band.
Henry Fillmore and I'm a violist, so like
right. I guess like for like just full transparency for our listeners, I guess I am a saxophonist. I do love it. I really do. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to be transparent.
But anyway, need to get my truth out there.
My truth out there, yeah.
Second episode, speaking our truths.
Join us then for speaking our truth. But like even the way that like these biographies are written about him, like even like just 2 years ago, I got one from the University of Illinois. And the way that they describe him in it, it's very lionized. It's very, like, Henry Fillmore was, like, an all-American kind of guy. And I put that in, like, heavy quotations, because, like, what is all-American? But, like, we understand... White. But that's the thing, is, like, on its face, you're like, what is all-American? Like, what does that mean? Like, it's because in some stories, All-American is an immigrant story. In some stories of All-American, it's the black story from slavery to now. In some stories, the All-American story is a rise to power from poverty. Like, there's that. But then, like, for some reason, whenever we, like, decide to write about history, because whenever we write about history, we are, in fact, telling a story, right? Like, we're telling ourselves a story, which is, I guess, also the other point of this podcast is that we are trying to tell a different story. We're trying to help correct the narrative from being one-sided or like too heavily on one side. Correct. And I think that University of Illinois biography of him is part of that. And they said like they described him as all-American kind of guy, which means like he loved football, he loved band, and he loved his dog. And I was just like, yeah, that sounds right. I grew up with 100 of those. But it was just like, but what was the point of saying that?
Well, and I think that the craziest thing is, and we'll get into as, you know, the podcast goes on, you know, is like, on the contrary, someone like Artie Matthews who literally, I mean, he did everything in his power to sort of create this space for himself and be present in the community. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of he was an activist in a lot of ways and was a huge figure in Cincinnati. No information on the guy.
Right, it was crazy. And I want to even, like, you kind of, like, paused before the word activist. And, like, I want to, like, unpack that. And I think the reason you paused is because, like, you realize that is a kind of a loaded term. But I think that, like, we all... Yeah, like, these days. And I, like, even for me, like, I have to kind of sit down, like, with the idea of, like, what is activism? Because, like, I remember like whenever I was like a youngin' back in undergrad. Oh, gather around, children. Let me tell you my story of undergrad. So I'm at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro for my undergrad. So like, I really am a Carolina boy, like through and through. I even did all of my teaching experience in North Carolina and South Carolina.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
love, I love the Carolinas. Like, it's a very beautiful
Wait,
landscape. Yes.
have you watched? Side note: what's that show on Netflix with the Carolinas, the boys? I don't know. Sorry.
Oh, that I think it is called The Boys. But my favorite one is actually Bless the Hearts. That's on Hulu. It's the animated one. Maya Rudolph, because it's in this place called Greenpoint, and that's so funny because every time they talk about it, I'm pretty sure that they're actually just talking about Greensboro, North Carolina, because that's where I went to undergrad, and every time I look at it, I'm like, there are so many references to like that part of the state. But like, so it's so fascinating too because like politically, it's gaining a lot more attention, like just the Carolinas. And I think Jamie Harris had a lot to do with it. Just like that entire run against Lindsey Graham. It's just like, oh, suddenly now we're paying attention to the
Oh,
Southeast.
Lindsey Graham, here we go.
But we don't have to do that. That's not this podcast.
That's third episode.
That's someone else's podcast. That's not us. So yeah, so like back in undergrad, they had us do this. We would talk about like the idea of advocacy inside of schools and like kind of activism, and it was kind of like this moment of like redefining what activism means, because this is like the time in North Carolina's history where, so this is like, I go to undergrad in 2011. So this is the 2011, the Republicans have like taken like the House, like all that stuff. And so like there's this major cutting of public works and especially of public education. And so we kept seeing like band programs disappearing and music programs disappearing because the programs were being cut, like their funding was being cut from that was once being provided by the state. And so our conversation in undergrad quickly shifted to not to how do you thrive in like a pre-existing band program or a pre-existing music program, but it was how do you make sure your job is safe? How do you make sure that you have a job? How do you make sure that you have enough money to survive? Yada, yada, yada. And so our conversations went from thriving in educational aims to these kids are in the middle of a program that they can't really turn around in. And this is the job opportunity aspect at the end of it. So it became a salvage job almost. And like those same few years, you start seeing this brain drain from North Carolina of a bunch of music teachers running to Texas and to kind of like down that way because
that's where
you're from.
We love that.
Because music is really valued at the public state level.
Well, especially band.
Especially band.
It's it's huge in Texas.
Right. So, like...
We like football and we like band.
All-American,
folks.
Right?
All-American, baby.
And I think that's what gets us back to the whole idea of, like, then you have... But, like, a lot of these people, like, a lot of band directors, like, what is, like, the demographic of most band directors? Like, especially, like, when we...
Oh, white, middle-aged male.
Yeah, white, middle-aged male. And it's usually... And, like, you almost are in the band program, especially marching band, and it almost feels like you're a cog in a machine. Like, almost like...
Yeah,
it's very factory worker, very line process. The Model T, like the conveyor belt model of like how you bring in and push out, which is something interesting because my dad was a superintendent of schools down in South Carolina. It was the one I grew up in, and I remember we were talking about this maybe a couple of summers ago, and he said like education in the United States took on the conveyor belt model for its efficiency. So it's the same reason we think about like the class of 2020, the class of 2021. That's a very Model T, how we produce cars aspect and mindset. And so we think about keeping people on pace. So that's how we broke it down to the subcomponents of like credits. So like the credits that you receive for going to physics, the credit you receive for going to music, the credit you receive from going to PE. And so then you can put a formal evaluation of what is more important in the public system by putting more or less credits onto those assignments or onto those courses. So then if a kid has had one semester of band, prioritizes pretty much everything else because you only need one credit to graduate from North Carolina schools with a high school diploma. Then it becomes a choice that students stay in it, which is interesting because it's actually a turn from how we started music education in this country, which was in 1801. It was deemed a public work in Boston, Massachusetts, and then that's the first school district to have public music education, and then Cincinnati was the second one. So Cincinnati is the second one. So I think that's why it's so important that we're talking about Henry Fillmore and we're talking about Artie Matthews, because we actually are a birthplace of music education and how we think about these canons and how we think about the people who make up the canon. Because Henry Fillmore, we know him for his trombone smears and his kind of ragtime music, but we don't realize is that he learned all of that from Artie Matthews. Artie Matthews and the black community who had invented rag, and Scott Joplin in St. Louis, those people were the primary progenitors of ragtime, and they're the ones who were refining it. And you even see Artie Matthews trying to, and you'll talk about more, is how he tried to start the Cosmopolitan School, but why is it whenever CCM was formed, it absorbed all of the music schools in Cincinnati except for the Cosmopolitan School, which was primarily ran by black people and was ran for black people.
The issue that I have in this country when we talk about stuff, and you and I have sort of talked about this too, is like, it really does boil down to race. I mean, there's so many things, like, and even when you have conversations with people and they just kind of give you these excuses about why things are the way that they are, like, oh, that was a long time ago, or like, I'm not racist, I just don't, blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, okay, but let's boil it down, let's have the conversation even though it's going to be hard. Because at the end of the day, it has a huge, I think with what we'll get into more and more is when you look at these characters, you see somebody like we just talked about earlier, somebody who is like working really hard and is good at what they do and is like trying to create a space for himself and for his community and is working towards having that be recognized, and someone who is benefiting off of using culture, music, whatever, and taking that and turning it into a way that can become popularized, which is terrible, and it still happens today.
We're saying 19th century world because that's who these characters live in the 19th century. Like their lifetimes existed in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So like we have to kind of talk about it like that, but we can see how that affects even now because Henry Fillmore's music is still definitely being played. Being an activist at that time, like it just meant existing and wanting to exist as a more fuller version of yourself, because the American society said that black people weren't allowed to exist as fuller versions of themselves.
Right, and I think that's why I hesitated when I said activist, because when we hear the word activist today, we think of somebody that is like very prominent in a bigger society outside of just their own community that is sort of pushing for things to change. And he is described as an activist in certain dissertations that I read because he was always advocating for desegregation.
The advocacy bit there, I mean, because he being an activist at the time, or not even being an activist at the time, he really was an activist. Like he really was making things. He was trying to make more space for the black community in general. Correct. So that's good. Like he needs that title as well. It's a time period where just trying to be a fuller version of yourself kind of earns you that moniker. And I guess that's where it is like, well, really, like it's still a perverse kind of idea just simply because we lived in a society where Jim Crow was so prevalent and that these codes existed on a invisible level that just to exist was activism, and like that in and of itself is perverse, right? Like people, the idea of being anti-racist is that people are allowed to just exist, like in whatever form they feel is necessary for their existence and for this lifetime. They are allowed to just exist and to think about other humans as just being other humans. I'm connecting that to like being a teacher, because being a teacher, like that was when like in undergrad they were telling us you got to be ready to fight. And it was just interesting. It was like, why is something that we decided in 1801 as a fundamental part of our society suddenly up for question? Right. And so now existing as a music teacher is activism.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what I appreciated about our class, and this is something that I've talked with our professor, Dr. Meyer, about, is that he's sort of breaking the norms of what, by designing this course, he said, like, I'm trying to think of something that is outside of what I would normally teach, like, you know, a bunch of dead white guys like Mozart, Handel, blah, so on and so forth, that we've kind of all been touched, like, we've gone over that in music history, then we've probably all taken a seminar over them. So I feel like, I think in this way, you know, you and I had discussed kind of what it means to be not racist versus like anti-racist. And for me, it's really important because I think in order for me as a white person existing in America right now, in order to be anti-racist is to actively educate myself and hopefully bring some sort, especially in the music sphere, brings some attention to people that get just overlooked, and it not just be like a trend, because they've very much been trends. So like we have to really put our foot down and sort of, especially as future academics, like I would like to be a university professor. It's
so would I.
For me to take this throughout my life and my career. So love that. Very excited.
I think this is a good place to take a break. All right, we'll be right back. And we're back.
So, Lee, you're going to get us started here on good old Henry Fillmore.
Yes. Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
I mean, and don't get me wrong, like, I enjoy a lot of his work, and, like, I have, for sure, scheduled some of his music for programs, like, that I have been conducting, and, like, and have had children participate in, like, honor bands where, like, he's playing, this music is being played. And, like, I recognize it for what it is, but I guess even in those moments, I didn't really know what it was,
right, and,
like, what it meant.
Well,
because to me, I was like, it's a fun tune.
I don't think, most people would know. And I think that this is going to be an interesting conversation that you will get into, which is like, because there's not education, this stuff that becomes these fun tunes that we play like in our high school or middle school growing up ends up having this crazy backstory that we're like, oh, we just kind of overlook that a little bit. So this will be fun to get into.
Yeah, this will be fun to get into. So let's get into it. So Henry Fillmore, he was born at the end of the 19th century. So he was born in 1881. He died in 1956. So that's about the time, span of time that we're looking at, just as like we're talking about like these characters. Okay. So he was a trombonist. He was a composer. And there's old word that used to be called a bandmaster. And, like, the reason I'm saying the word is because it actually is kind of important. So, like, around that time, they are probably the closest thing to an impresario that the band world has. Okay. That's related to, like, opera, which was, like, the largest form of entertainment at the time. Okay. So, like, an impresario is someone who is both the conductor and also is the business manager behind the scenes. Okay. So they're the ones like arranging the places. They're setting up like where the musicians are going to meet. If they are scripted musicians, so that person's got to find the musicians in that town, or if they're traveling, got to make all the travel arrangements. So like that would be it.
He runs the whole show.
Yeah, he runs the whole show.
Okay.
Yeah. So he loved circus music. So this was like a big thing at the time because just circuses were becoming a big thing, which in hindsight we now recognize is very cruel and inhumane way to treat animals. But at the time, this is a big thing. And I don't know if you knew this, but Cincinnati is actually like a really big circus town.
I didn't know.
Did you know that? No, okay, this is weird.
We kind of touched on vaudeville, but like that's like later, right?
That's a little bit later.
Okay.
But it's around that time. It's towards like the end of Fillmore's life. Okay. Is kind of when that's happening. But circus music in general, like it was really big, but circuses. So like Cincinnati, literally at the very large cemetery, the historical cemetery that's here in Cincinnati, that's where the Ringling Brothers are buried. Whoa. And along with like, yes, I know, along with like a lot of the original clowns and like quote unquote freaks so they're all buried in one like giant, like rather large mausoleum in Cincinnati.
Did not know that. That's crazy.
It's crazy.
Yeah,
it's very insane. There are like news reports from around the time of like animals escaping the zoo, like animals escaping the circus, and so like they were like, don't leave your homes, like there's a lion on the loose, and I was like, this is wild. So Cincinnati at the turn of the century was
a zoo.
Bellum? Is that? It was a zoo. It was almost literally a zoo. So so like let that be in the back of your mind about like how these people existed.
Yeah.
Like
give some context, okay? Just a little.
Give
bit.
a little context.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that's important.
Absolutely.
So but like I said, he was like described as like kind of like this all-American guy. So like he loved circus music, he loved football, he loved his dog, he loved band. Like that. Like that was it. But you know, like we can't discount the impact that he had on being a progenitor of band, right? Like the band sound, the wind ensemble, or the band really at its like most basic form. The band is very American. Like it's a very uniquely how it's exhibited and how it's interpreted here and expressed. It's very, very, very uniquely American. And so like we absolutely have Henry Fillmore to thank for as one of the people we can thank as being a progenitor of giving me my job,
right,
and giving a lot of my friends their jobs and helping to proliferate the expansion of conservatories like CCM. Right. And like the reason FSU is a big name is because of their band, program and their music program in general, right? Like in Texas.
I'm a graduate.
There you go.
Thank you. We won't.
And then you've got like.
Cut that
and
out.
then you've got all of cut that out.
Cut that out.
Then you got all of Texas. You know, like all of Texas has like someone like Henry Fillmore to thank for like a third of its economy. But actually, right?
Yeah.
So like, but that also comes from the fact that Henry Fillmore, he was given, and I'm being very, very explicit about saying the word given. He was given his family's publishing company, and so it was called the Fillmore Music Company. But like he was given this after he, I think it was 1905. Yeah, 1905. He is gifted an entire publishing company, and so it's a hymnal company, but he now has access to the technologies to allow you to at the time disseminate your ideas, right? Like, because this is a world that is not yet quite connected as intimately connected as we are now to be able to just have a voice conversation with another person. A really big way of getting out your ideas was to write something and to propagate it that way.
Yeah, you know what? That's actually what's interesting about that is I don't think we realize in that time how much power that is.
Yes.
Right.
It's the equivalent of like being a publisher at that time is the equivalent of being Mark Zuckerberg in like your town,
right? Or
in like your part of the state or in your part of the country.
Yeah, it's like you have Instagram and no one else does.
Yeah, like that's it. And it's like a one-way Instagram, or like a one-way Facebook. Like imagine if Mark Zuckerberg just got the ability. I mean, more so than he already does, the ability to just like fully propagate his idea of how he sees the world and how you should see the world too. And he doesn't have to worry about competitors basically putting out opposing ideas that he has to fend off. So he can glossy it up as much as he wants to and present it as well or as in any manner he wants to at that point, right? So yeah. So that's in 1905, but he graduated from CCM quite literally the year before. So he was at CCM starting in 1901. And what we know about CCM at the time, so from Dr. Stephen Meyer, and he's an expert on CCM. Okay, so he's a music historian at CCM. He's our professor, and he's also a music historian on CCM and Cincinnati music. And he talked about just when everybody was, when CCM was basically forming, because it was born out of several different schools of music that were separated by ethnicity, correct?
Right.
Yeah, they were separated by ethnicity. So like you'd have like the German music school, or you'd have the Italian music school, or you'd have like the French music school.
Right.
You'd have and then you have the black school, which was the Cosmopolitan school that Artie Matthews had, and you'll talk about him a little bit later. But like so this is around the time all that is being conglomerated and being aggregated and built and rebuilt into something else that actively was excluding the black community. Right. So now he has access to people who will actually hear what he has to say and actually have like an audience to give his music to that is being bankrolled. Right, like because being a part of an institution like that means that you have a lot of money. That is the point of being part of an institution. The reason why, whenever we look for graduate schools, we look at well-connected institutions is because well-connected institutions are able to help fund the individual and to keep the individual on the path of whatever it is they're looking for. So he has all of that access and all of this stuff, like just to make his empire with. And he does it. The way that he does it is that he basically just writes his own music and publishes his own music through his publishing company, but he does it through different names, and that's kind of like shady to me because we think about if you kind of take it back to like the present day analogy of like these big tech companies, if you think about like Jeff Bezos, I think he's probably the closest that we can think of because he is both the market and he is the competitor.
Correct.
Because he is the publisher, but then he started putting out under different pseudonyms. He started putting out different compositions because he explicitly says it is to make sure that he didn't dilute the value of his name. So the ones that he put his name on were the ones that he knew would draw the biggest numbers, but by adding basically fake competitors under different pseudonyms, he made it look as if there's actual people who are competing against him, but he is controlling the competition.
Right. Same concept.
So it's just like, same concept. And so like that's another way that like we now associate very closely band ragtime with Henry Fillmore, because Henry Fillmore made sure that he was very closely associated with band ragtime. Right. By controlling the market.
And also, by controlling the market, and also in the sense that it is important to remember in contrast to Artie Matthews, he was given this. Like, let's just
he was given this.
So this was all created on a basis of privilege that he then still exploited and made his way.
Yep.
Yes, round of applause for Henry Fillmore.
Round of applause. But like, but it's interesting, right? Because like, he made his name. He made his name what it is, and then I think about the fact that like there are major universities to this day who still refer to Henry Fillmore as Uncle Fillmore or Uncle Henry, or like the grandfather. And we like up until last year, like I went and I looked at the band repertory project, and they have listed. Different notable performances of this music, and the last one I saw was like it was like 4 of them in 2019, and I am sure, and they were like spring concerts, and I am sure that had the pandemic not gone blossomed into what it is today, they would still be performing that music, and these are like notable places. Like one of them is in South Carolina. And it's a high school that I know in South Carolina. It's Nation Ford High School out in Fort Mill, South Carolina. And so like that one was in 2012, but like I'm very aware of where that is. The most recent one was Central Michigan University. They performed it in 2019, so last spring concerts. Like I'm pretty sure that it would have gotten more plays today because there are enough points of them 2012, 14, and 19. I think we can say that it would have been. It's still in vogue in some way.
Absolutely.
So like, and then you realize like, well, he did that. He intentionally made it that way. This was something he wanted. But what the music that we get from him is really influenced by the circus. So it's very lively, very brassy, very quick, and it's meant to stir very certain emotions, very certain excited emotions inside of the listener, because they are looking at very exciting things. I mean, you're looking at a live lion, like that's
crazy.
Terrifying.
Terrifying.
It's crazy. It's
fun.
Terrifying and crazy, but like I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm looking at a tiger like less than 10 feet away from me. Like, yes, entertainment. Turn on that brass band. Heck yeah, yeehaw. So he is also kind of seen as like a very eccentric character anyway, like in and of his right. Like people just kind of see him as just being like this kind of crazy guy. So like to form, he marries an exotic dancer. Now we have to put a little caveat here. Exotic dancer at the time didn't quite necessarily mean the same it means today. She was just working in like circus, and you know what? It might have also been kind of the same implications from today.
Let her live.
Let her live her life, you know? It's her story. But we don't talk much about her outside of this, but Maybelle May Jones. And so they met in St. Louis, which is interesting too, because we talk about the idea that ragtime was born and cradled in St. Louis, right, by Scott Joplin. So now he marries a woman who has spent an extensive amount of time in that area, and she's already not seen as somebody who's part of like high society. So she probably was hanging out with like the black people of the time, or the Creole around the area, right, or like the indigenous people of the area. Like she probably really was hanging out with these people just because she already didn't have much in common with the whites of upper standing and from where she's from.
Right.
So like there's another like
connection.
Road and another connection to ragtime and how it makes its way to Henry Fillmore. So like he grew up in Cincinnati where ragtime was happening a lot. Like it was just happening like in the air. You could probably just like walk around. And even now, like you can drive around and you can see like all these old buildings that were bars back in the last century. And like you can see like, oh, this is clearly a jazz bar. There would have been absolutely Scott Joplin floating through the air. So like it was just part of his being, but because he's a white man of a certain standing, he probably didn't actually hear it. Like he didn't actually listen to it. It might be bad at your background, but it takes a moment of salience to like actually hear what's going on.
Right.
And so I think maybe time with Mabel, like I think that does it, right? Like that gives him a moment of salience, because she probably was like, it was probably some offhanded thing like, oh, this reminds me of home. And now he has an emotional connection to it, which now means he now hears it. And now it finds its way into his music. And
right,
we have very strong evidence that it very strongly makes its way into his music. Of his collections, there are something like 15 novelty tunes that feature this thing called a trombone smear. Now, do you know what a trombone smear is?
I don't.
Okay, so it's this weird sound. I'm going to use Lass's trombone. It's one of his tunes, and it's simply the very beginning of it. You'll hear, this is entire band playing, but you'll hear the prominent use of the trombone, and then I'll kind of describe it afterwards.
Do love a good trombone.
Do love a good trombone. So that sound, yeah. Lots of glissandos. And literally someone on Reddit described it or defined it as a nasty glissando. So like, I'm going to go with that. Like, yeah, I have a few degrees, but I think that's the best. I think that's the best definition of it. Yeah. So like that nasty trombone sound. Yeah. And so the idea here is that that's very part of, from our perspective as 21st century humans, to us, it feels like it's just connected to the circus. It feels like it's just part of vaudeville. But I guess that's the thing about American history, is that we're really good at deassimilating and reassimilating cultural pieces and making them and reassociating them with something that it wasn't as strongly associated with. It might have 100%. Connected to it, but it was not actually where it like originated from, quote unquote.
We don't give the credit to the originator.
Right. And so like that, so like, yeah, like it very much was in Trump, like that stuff was very much involved with the circus. But we also know that Lass's trombone, when it was produced, sorry, not very 21st century, when it was published, It was published with an image on the front of it. So like all old music comes with like an image as well. And like, you know, I think some new music also comes with like embroideries and stuff. But back then it was more like, here's a character. And when you're looking at it, this one, Las's trombone is one of them. And disclaimer, a nice little buff into the N-word. But even then, the Fillmore Music House, Cincinnati, Ohio, everything for the musician, called collection the Niggah Smears. Or like basically a hard R, but they put it with an H. It's very interesting. And then,
wow, thank you so much. That really makes it so much better.
It really softens it up. So these Niggah Smears, one of them, they call them 7 original trombone rags. And on there, the character is in fact in blackface. It is a blackface character playing the trombone with the elongated hands that look apish, the face that looks cartoonish and like a clown, the engorged lips, the wearing a weird outfit that's not really fitting. But I think what's interesting about this one is that the clothes actually kind of fit. Like he almost looks like a maestro, but it's like making fun of the idea that no, you'll never get to be this, but we'll dress you up as this. It's kind of like it kind of gives me the vibes of like you can dress up a pig, but it's still a pig.
Yeah, yeah.
And that, like, looking at this, like, that's what I get. Like, it's very like, I remember the KKK back home in South Carolina, like, kind of vibes. Like, this is.
You know what's interesting is the idea of like even using these sort of like it's like circus music or like ragtime music, which probably wasn't seen as something that was of like status, and then further exploiting the black community by putting this character with it, even though this music then becomes popular.
Well, but hasn't that been done like over and over again throughout music history?
Over and over again. And people are like, oh, it's fine.
Well, I mean, like...
That was back in the day.
Well, right, like the entire progenation of hip-hop, right? Like how hip-hop even came to be part of the mainstream culture. And I feel like it's following exactly the same way. It was like some white producer realized that there was money to be had in the black community by selling black things back to black people, and then expanding it over to white people by finding soft versions of those hip hop artists and those gangster rappers and presenting them to young white audiences.
Right. And then it becomes acceptable. And it's weird. It's crazy because he was able to do it like as a one-man show.
Yeah, and I think that's like the age of connection, right? Like that's the difference between the age of connection and the age of limited connection. I don't want to say it's disconnected. It's just it was very limited and very controlled information. Because like you do have like TVs and radios and like the beginnings of TV and like you have radio stations. Like we have lots of evidence. Like Cincinnati was a major hub of broadcasting as well. And so, like, you have, like, the strongest radio tower is in Cincinnati. So it's like, we definitely, that is not a problem. But yeah, so, like, but because you have these publishers who are allowed to just have their own thing and and no one's regulating this because there are no competing publishers who come from these backgrounds because they've been left out. Now you have the way of someone being able to build their own name through and reappropriating something to be as if I was the one who made it up. It's like 7 original trombone rags. That can't be true, and it's not true. And even Las's trombone. Look at like the description for Las's trombone. If you ever go like look it up, and we'll put like in the show notes. But like the Las's trombone, the description that he put for it is the big, lanky, colored gentleman sliding a rag with the minstrel band. So like. The word minstrel is understood to be exactly for blackface at the time. It was a very popular thing at the time. None of this is a secret. None of it's dog whistling. It is exactly what it is. It's only dog whistling now because it's lost its original meaning.
Right. What happens is that this music is lasting because it was, I almost said produced as well, but it was printed because he had access to printing based on his family and his race, whereas you have actual black artists creating these genres and making their own space, and their music doesn't last because it's not recognized. It's just stolen.
tangled up this narrative of history, we then say that
Right.
it's the cheap imitation of what the actual imitation
Yes.
is.
Yes, and then we're like, Henry Fillmore, yay, let's do Henry Fillmore concerts to this day, and like he came up with all this really cool stuff.
Right, but even on print, Henry Fillmore is admitting that this is being taken from a different community, right? Like minstrelsy is on its face saying, I took this from the black people and now I'm going to represent it in a caricature way to white audiences.
Yeah. It's literally giving credit in the most racist, awful,
perverse way.
Yeah.
And so like even to like so like we know that he's propagating this stuff too, because he name drops Sousa. Like Sousa is using the entire Henry Fillmore called family. Like it's like an Ebonics way of saying just family. And he misspells the word family to say family. It's very strange. But then he says, get in line and have your band play them. And so it's just like, he wants more people. He wants this sound out there. And so what happens is that you get a stamp of that sound. And that's kind of the idea that we're saying, like, this is blackface. It's sonic blackface. Because this sound is no longer... This sound has been directly tied to a time period where minstrelsy was involved, and that minstrelsy was used and viewed as the primary form of entertainment.
Come full circle. Full circle, baby.
It's come full circle. That's Henry Fillmore. I think that's a pretty good place to take our last break. We'll be right back. And we're back. So I wanted to bring attention to one source in particular, and that was a trombonist named Douglas Yeo. He was a Boston Symphony Orchestra principal trombonist for a really long time. But he goes through and he writes a very forceful argument about how to recontextualize these works of art that that come from very troubled places. So the name of that piece was Trombone Players, It's Time to Bury Henry Fillmore's Lastest Trombone. And if you want to see like a really detailed diagramming of this argument, that's a really good place to start. Otherwise, that brings us to the end of our first episode of Music History 601. I'm Lee Burgess.
And this is Shelby Thompson.
And we'll talk to you next time.